So, are we living as slaves to the cloud? I know, it's a heavy, incredibly provocative question, right? But it's actually the central theme of this fascinating new manifesto that we're unpacking today. The authors are making a pretty bold argument here that our growing dependency on centralized AI infrastructure has quietly, almost invisibly, stripped us of our digital independence, essentially turning us into renters of our own cognitive abilities. In fact, the source material explicitly describes our current setup as a form of digital servitude. They argue that we've taken our absolute most valuable asset, our intellectual and creative processes, and just completely outsourced them. We've handed them over to this massive centralized big data paradigm that's controlled by, just a handful of massive corporations? The manifesto is waving a huge red flag here, warning us that relying on these distant external servers leaves our workflows, our private data, and literally our everyday ability to function incredibly vulnerable to a sudden disruption. So, welcome to today's explainer on cognitive sovereignty, the fight for digital freedom. Today, we're going to impartially dive straight into the author's core argument that the world needs a massive, urgent shift away from centralized cloud AI, and we need to move toward local, decentralized infrastructure. Let's dig in and see exactly why the authors believe this shift is an absolute necessity.
Part 1. The centralization trap.
If we trace the historical timeline the authors lay out, it's pretty eye-opening. Back between 2010 and 2015, AI was this open, highly collaborative ecosystem. But as we pushed into the commercialization and centralization phases, billions of dollars flooded in and shifted all that power into a tight oligopoly. The authors argue that by trading our fundamental control for the slick convenience of cloud APIs, we inadvertently built these massive single points of failure. And according to the manifesto, that's leading us straight into a huge crisis point between 2025 and 2026.
Which brings us to Part 2, the 54-minute shutdown. To show just how fragile this all is, the manifesto points to a specific Friday shutdown over at Anthropic. And honestly, the timeline is staggering. Look at this. At 5:21 p.m., a U.S. export control directive is received. By 5:40 p.m., the API gateway shutdown is initiated, and by 5:54 p.m., literally just 54 minutes later, a complete global shutdown was finalized. Millions of users all over the world instantly lost access to Claude. No warning, no due process, just gone. And when that global access was severed, bam, $2.3 billion in enterprise contracts were instantly put at risk. We're talking over 15,000 enterprises across 50 different countries suddenly waking up to the reality that their daily business operations could just be halted by a remote administrative decision, a decision they had absolutely zero control over. It highlights this terrifying reality the authors want us to see. Your entire workflow can be completely wiped out by someone flipping a switch thousands of miles away.
So how does something like that even happen? Well, legally speaking, it comes down to the Export Administration Regulations, specifically something called the Deemed Export Doctrine. Under 15 CFR 734.13, sharing advanced AI technology with foreign nationals is legally classified as exporting dual-use technologies or weapons. Basically, giving someone access to an AI model is treated under the law exactly the same way as shipping physical munitions overseas. And a strict legal definition leads to what the source calls the domestic employee paradox. It's wild, because the law applies to foreign nationals regardless of where they are physically located. Even Anthropic's own employees, the ones living in the US on H-1B visas who actually built the AI, were abruptly locked out of their own creations. The manifesto highlights this as just an impossible contradiction, right? Where the creators themselves cannot legally use the very tools they engineered. Moving on to Part 3. Exposing the kill switch. The authors make it clear that centralized API connections are inherently fragile. Think of it like a frayed cable that could snap at any second. Cloud providers use API gateway manipulation that essentially acts as a binary switch. They couldn't just selectively block users geographically because, trying to verify citizenship in real time at API speeds, it's technically unscalable. Plus, collecting passport data would heavily violate privacy laws like GDPR. Because of all that, the centralized architecture forced an all-or-nothing approach. They had to block everyone globally just to stay compliant. And the economic fallout from flipping that binary switch? It is massive. By restricting AI models to the US-only market, the addressable AI market shrank by 95.3% overnight. Out of a massive $300 billion global market, only a $14 billion US market was left standing. That means $286 billion in global revenue just evaporated, making it mathematically impossible for these cloud providers to pay off their massive infrastructure debts. Now, this mathematical reality quickly turns into a major economic crisis for everyday users. Because providers lost all that international revenue, the manifesto projects they are going to be forced to hike prices on their remaining U.S. customers by 300 to 500%, just to avoid bankruptcy. And what does that mean? It means small businesses are going to get priced out fast, creating this two-tier system where only massive corporations have the budget to rent AI. Part 4, defining cognitive sovereignty. So what's the solution? The authors present something they call the fortress model. This is all about the concept of architectural immunity, where you break away from rented power in the cloud and you shift toward owned power on local hardware. The core argument is simple. Physical ownership inherently protects your organization. Nobody can revoke your API key or terminate your service remotely if the literal machine running the AI is sitting physically inside your own building. This idea of cognitive sovereignty rests on 4 main pillars: hardware ownership, software control, data privacy using techniques like air gapping, and operational independence. And the authors make a fantastic legal point here. Under the Fourth Amendment, if the government wants to shut down your local server, they can't just flip a digital switch. They actually need a physical search warrant and due process to seize your property. When you contrast these two paradigms directly, the trade-offs are just crystal clear. Sure, cloud AI gives you instant scaling and there's no upfront capital required, but it leaves your control strictly in the hands of the vendor, and your reliability is totally at the mercy of external geopolitical events. Local AI, on the other hand, it wins definitively on total organizational control, absolute data privacy, immediate latency, and most importantly, self-determined business continuity. You are in the driver's seat. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5. The Sovereign AI Roadmap. The source actually outlines the specific hardware requirements to make this a reality, and they establish a really important golden rule. For local AI, your VRAM capacity is way more critical than raw GPU speed. Think of VRAM like your computer's short-term memory workspace. The bigger the AI model, the bigger the disk you need to spread out all its data. A basic 7 billion parameter model, that can run on an accessible 4 to 8 gigabytes of VRAM. But if you're trying to run frontier 405 billion parameter models locally, you're absolutely looking at multi-GPU setups requiring upwards of 200 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, I know what you're thinking. Hardware is a huge investment. But the financial argument presented here is backed by some seriously striking ROI calculations. The manifesto shows that for high-utilization workloads, a local server investment, which typically ranges from $2,000 to $50,000, can actually break even against cloud API cost in just 3.7 months. Over 5 years, that translates to an 83.8% cost savings. And that's massively aided by the fact that open-source models have zero marginal distribution cost. And it's not just about throwing money at hardware. Software optimization is doing some heavy lifting here too. The source highlights incredible techniques like INT4 quantization. Essentially, this compresses the model's data footprint without losing its core smarts, decreasing memory requirements by up to 75%. This right here is the cryptographic key to unlocking massive open-source models on consumer-grade hardware, making sure your data is kept totally secure on local circuits without sacrificing too much quality. Well, we've covered a massive amount of ground today, and it really all culminates in this one passionate final call to action from the manifesto. Own the silicon. Own your mind. Own your future. It just perfectly summarizes the entire argument. Rented power in the cloud is inherently unstable, totally subject to the whims of geopolitics and corporate decisions. But owned local power, that is permanent. Which leaves us with one final, pretty massive question to think about. Are you ready to rethink where your cognitive infrastructure truly lives? Will you let your workflows remain dependent on a centralized cloud that can just vanish in 54 minutes? Or will you take the leap toward building your own sovereign AI ecosystem? It's a profound choice about the very future of our digital autonomy. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. And remember, always keep questioning how your technology actually works.